My name is Irene Gunther. I'm a professor at the University of Houston in the Honors College, and I'm proud to present the work of my 230 class in Modern American History. In that class, we examined in depth the Great Migration of some 6 million African Americans who fled the Jim Crow South and looked to find better lives in the North and in the West. We studied not only how and why the Great Migration occurred, but also its long-term consequences and its current manifestations. And my students then created wide-ranging research papers and creative projects, art, literature, spoken poem, photography, digital, and music projects to educate themselves and the public about this transformative, yet largely unrecognized movement. I want to applaud my students that despite having to go very suddenly from in-class learning to virtual learning, they somehow pull together these remarkable projects that, as you can see when you watch the video, really reflect their thought and their efforts, a lot of time, and I'm sure a great deal of reflection as they grappled with the issues of race and racism in the United States. It's our hope, both theirs and mine, that you'll not only enjoy the video, but that you'll also share it with friends and perhaps with people you don't know as well who might want to learn more about this transformative event in American history. Enjoy.
I decided to do a painting for my creative project because I think visual images are the best way for viewers to really understand and see what happened in history. My painting was inspired by the issue of segregation of the neighborhoods in the North between the whites and the colored people. This topic was discussed in the Warmth of the Sun's book, as well as I learned more about the segregation within the neighborhoods in class. I decided to paint a picture to illustrate the differences between the whites and the colored people. I used dull colors to represent the life of the colored people, and I used brighter colors to represent the life of the whites. I also drew different houses to show how the whites lived in nicer homes compared to the African Americans. I chose to paint this issue because I found it very interesting, and I think people should know more about the segregation that occurred in the North.
I chose to do a poem highlighting the resilience of the people during the Great Migration and Civil Rights Movement. One phrase I repeat throughout my poem is, "We will never forget," because we all have a responsibility to keep these stories close to us. Although we can't truly understand the Black struggle unless we are Black, everyone understands what it means to struggle to some extent. This is why I chose to title my poem "We're All the South," because I drew inspiration from Malcolm X's quote on certain issues, "The whole country is the South." Although African Americans suffered from the North to the South, they also rose together. Likewise, we also need to learn together. Keeping "We're All the South" in mind, I also wrote about the Bangladesh Liberation War because my family's from Bangladesh and it was happening around the same time. I mirrored the writing not to compare the two because suffering can't be compared, but to highlight our shared humanity and the fact that we can all sympathize with suffering, though our suffering may not be the same. From both poems, I hope people can see the damaging effects treating people who are different as others can be. While we may not look the same, act the same, etc., we're all the South in that we want a better future for the next generations, and only when our differences are respected and celebrated can we truly taste the warmth of other suns. We are all the South. We will never forget Martin Luther King Jr. and other visionaries who helped lead our people closer to freedom. Tortured by bigots, arrested on multiple occasions, and ultimately assassinated because he refused to see us shackled and owned. We will never forget our grandmothers and grandfathers, the people of the revolution, the people who stood face to face with loaded barrels and stared death in the eyes with their heads held high, dignity intact. The people who were tortured for information until their last breath, but no information dared escape their breath. We will never forget those yearning for the warmth of other suns, only to be denied time and time again. We will never forget those who risked it all to travel through treacherous conditions, holding on to the hope that their future may live. We will never forget those who died only knowing a world of subjugation, generations learning rules for the sake of learning, keeping quiet for the sake of surviving, casting aside understanding for the sake of living. We will never forget the stories of the strong and innocent, people like Emmett Till, people like Rosa Parks, people who didn't back down despite the world being against them. They didn't know we would go through anything to see our people free. Why can't you just forgive them, they say. But how can we? Why is the burden of forgiveness and moving forward always left to the victims? We will never forget the millions of lives that were lost at the hands of the oppressors because of ignorance, selfishness, and xenophobia. We will never forget the women and girls who were brutally raped just because their oppressors felt they could. We will never forget those whose choices and futures were ripped from them, stripped from them, beaten out of them. We will never forget the countless lives that were lost as a result of lynchings, baseless accusations, torture upon torture, and killings just because. We will never forget the ones who are easily forgotten, the ones with nameless graves, the ones who were given no graves, the ones who were lost in a sea of bodies, the ones who were never claimed by family members still searching, the ones who quietly gave their lives in selfless attempts to save others. We will never forget. They tried to break us, but they only made us stronger. They tried to divide us, but they only succeeded in uniting us further. If you look at America now, you will see a country made up of fearless warriors working together. You will see the African American community as puzzle pieces working cohesively towards the bigger picture, building the community up. These stories of resilience ripple from the north to the south. May we never forget.
My project revolves around the Black soldiers who came home from war and were met with violence and sometimes even death. My entire project was inspired by a single line from the book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. She writes, "He had survived the war only to be killed at home." This was in reference to a story about a man named Wilbur Little, who was a Black man that served a tour in World War I and was beaten to death by a mob when he came home. At first, I wanted to make a painting on it, but eventually I settled on a digital artwork because I thought it was a better way to get my point across. In my artwork, you will notice that the soldier does not have a distinct face. This is because lynchings of Black veterans happened so much that I didn't just want to tell one person's story through my artwork. I wanted to show the fate of many. For the soldier's death, I chose for him to be hanged because that was what happened when people were legally lynched according to the government, and because I found it outrageous that the government condoned hanging someone as a punishment well into the early 1900s.
I chose to do a poem for my creative project because I wanted to do a unique artwork where it didn't use pictures but words so that each person who read it could have their own unique picture in their mind, the same way that I had pictures in my mind as I was reading The Warmth of Other Suns. I hope that my poem inspires people to think about how the Black female experience differs from their own. I hope to uplift the Black women who read my poem, and I hope that this just sparks a conversation about the feelings and the inequality in this country and the treatment of Black women. Who are we? Our skin comes in many shades. Our hair comes in many textures. Our natural features are mocked, yet others pay thousands for those exact same features. We feel like we're not seen. We feel like we're not heard. We are paid 62 cents for every dollar a white man earns. Our pain is overlooked by medical professionals. We die 2.5 times the national average during childbirth compared to other women. Our intelligence is questioned. Our accomplishments are diminished. We are stereotyped before interviews because of our names. We are stereotyped as mad, angry, impatient, and argumentative, but in reality, we are just passionate and not willing to settle when we know we deserve more and better. We cry at night because our husbands, brothers, and sons are taken from us at the hands of law enforcement and other acts of senseless violence. But despite everything, we are brave, we are strong, we are powerful, we are courageous, we are creative, we are innovative, we are independent. We are doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, students, and everything else people said we couldn't be. We are queens. We will one day be heard. We will be seen. Who are we? We are the Black women in America.
My piece is called Honesty, Headlines, and Health Inequities. Life isn't fair is a cliche used to describe situations that do not occur in one's favor. However, does this apply to the health of American citizens? Is access to healthcare in the United States fair? This creative piece transformed research findings that have examined the differences in access to healthcare and health outcomes between blacks and whites in the United States into newspaper headlines. Headlines are used and have been used to bring attention to topics of interest, whether they are headlines on social media platforms today or newspapers from the 1920s. This piece was created to enlighten the American people of the honest health disparities that have existed, currently exist, and will continue to exist in the United States if no action is taken. I was inspired to create this piece by my experience in research in health disparities, despite knowing that I live in a world and a country where racism and inequity exist. I did not know the extent of which they affect an individual's health and how deeply rooted and intertwined our present-day battles are with the pasts. This course has shown me how history continues to repeat itself in the United States. This repetition of the same battles being fought and the same inequities being served have highlighted the failures of the United States government and the American citizens to acknowledge our shortcomings as a country and to learn from them to ensure a better United States for the generations to come.
Hello, my name is Jonas Eberhard, and for my final project I decided to depict the narrative as it is described in Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. Now, as soon as there was mention of a possible visual arts final project, I knew that I wanted to create something with pen on paper that would incorporate text from the book. I found Wilkerson's words moving and powerful, and wanted to use her words in my project to help describe the scenarios I drew. For example, on the bottom left corner, surrounding the tenements, we have the text explaining the terrible housing situation in Chicago. The headcloth has the testimony from page 44, "These were the facts of their lives," which I found incredibly powerful. I did some research to make sure that my drawing is at least partially historically informed. For example, the train is the silver meteor that George Starling might have boarded in 1945. And the tenements and sharecropper shacks were likely what many migrants could expect to find at either end of their journey. The name for my drawing is The Kinder Mistress, which comes from the poem at the beginning of part 4 in Wilkerson's book. To me, this poem captures the emotional heartache of the millions who left the South. Overall, this project was very inspiring to me, and in the end, it was quite rewarding. I am thankful for this opportunity to express myself through visual arts for once.
My project is titled The Voices of Jazz. It's a mixed medium project consisting of a collage and painting using acrylic paints. It highlights the major figures that form the jazz genre in the cities that African Americans migrated to, such as Chicago, Detroit, and Harlem. I was inspired to create this as jazz music added a new dimension to the civil rights movement. As political policy and social norms were put in place to discriminate against African Americans, even in the North, many jazz musicians and bands use their talent to be a voice for this community, fighting for the freedom and equality of blacks in the nation.
I created a collage of photos that I pasted on the letters of the word home. Home is considered a place of safety, a place where one can grow and prosper. For black Southerners who lived in some of the worst conditions in the nation, there was nowhere but up after leaving the South. However, during the Great Migration, blacks were not able to choose which location or neighborhood they wanted to call home. Instead, they were not given many options, and they usually were concentrated in the worst parts of the city. This made it hard for them to prosper and grow out of poverty. The South today has the largest concentration of African Americans still struggling to provide better opportunities for poor children. This topic relates to the struggle seen with the Great Migration that was covered in class. More specifically, it focuses on the effects of cities and neighborhoods that were deemed predominantly black areas.
Hi, I'm Surbi Gupta, and I've written this poem, Strange Times, regarding the lynchings. This poem illustrates a perspective not from the slave's perspective, not from the slave owner's perspective, but from the viewpoints of a bystander observing these lynchings. and representing an injustice to mankind. These took place throughout the country, and it also drew inspiration from Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, in the particular scene whenever George Swanson Sterling got caught stealing oranges from the trees and he feared death. And then also inspiration from Strange Fruit, which vividly describes the miseries, the pain, and unfairness behind these lynchings. From class lectures and discussions to these sources, it's evident lynchings were the outcome of the division and exclusion taking place amongst the white and blacks across the country. Strange time. Time has passed. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Under the moonshine lays a bloody rock. Veterans, Mexicans, women to care, those cotton-colored, self-justified, leaving no one to spare. For plucking the communal oranges could born a succinct carnage. Together they joined to observe this foul glory, and in no man's terms was this to be blurry. Truly there must be something hidden, but alas, there remains the same riddance. Mothers wailed, children veiled, true colors unveiled, as the last breath of the loved one is exhaled. Lynchings, oh lynchings, when will these end? Allow the hushed humanly power to ascend. Morning sun rises, glistens over the nooks, especially the remnants of those false crooks.
So I spent a long time poring over and going down the rabbit hole of American eugenics and all the nitty-gritty things and how it affected so many people, how it affected certain groups more than others, how certain parts of our culture seeped through it, vice versa, how there was this sense of opposition to others, and how science and fact were manipulated to suit a certain rhetoric. And what struck me while working on this project and learning about all these topics in class is how present all of this is. Although eugenics and other topics may be easy to dismiss as antiquated things of the past, a relic of underdeveloped science and society, there are some things that we haven't quite yet shaken, and hopefully the visuals of this poem can depict that in some way. Men of science. Each life marked up in a file system of letters and numbers, diagnoses of promiscuous, passionate, feeble-minded poor, of wanderlust. The defective races are too dangerous, the black, the colored, the slanted, speaking the tongues of, from the lands of, the disabled, the poor, the worthless. Sample size 0, a million, steeped in fluid of my mind's own making. We protect our superiority, we don't need the mental defectives, so we do ourselves the great favor of severing our ties from a bloodline that has never screamed anything other than please. So we ignore, hold on to something, anything to distract us from the clanging of steel against steel, the growling stomach acid, a neighborhood, a street down, the freed ones and our need for them, the successes of the colored ones, the women, the unknown, if my future will ever recover. And young science emerges, vibrant flashing theories and graphs and tables and pamphlets. It is better for all the world. These lesser sacrifices are worth it. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And we feel good. I feel soothed by these conclusions. They remind me that I am okay, I am fine, I am not deficient. They are the savages, the defective. And for this, I will fight. I live up here. The leaves were the color of sweet potatoes and of the summer sun when it sets. Back in my home country, sweet potatoes were at the top, untouchable, every branch in the world arching, aching to grow to that end. Then are the yams, rough terrain upon their skin, and at the bottom, the vitlots, the odd, the weird. It's no wonder they can't thrive, maturing late with their sunken eyes. The greenwoods of my home country, bound with shiny, proud eyes and slick, smooth suits, greener than ever, humble, sprawling hills on the horizon. Whenever a leaf buds, my skin crawls with resentment, chest twinging with unease. As I descend, I brush shoulders with you, and it is the perfect excuse to hold these veins in my hands and crush until green crumbles into transparent white. But it's their fault for being green, their fault that they're at the bottom. They can't help it. I see them underneath my Oxfords. They look so small and tiny from up here, so inferior, so born that way. In my home country, we are the land of the well-born, the home of the grave, as we recall memories not to forget how green I am, how easily I can bleed hate into normal, into righteousness, how readily anger and justification fly into my hands. These I cannot forget. In my home country, I learned that I cannot live up there.
My inspiration for this project came from the warmth of other suns, specifically when blacks arrived to the North and there were James Crow laws instead of Jim Crow. Essentially, the perception of laws changed, but the essence was the same. I wanted to illuminate how fleeing from the South, from lynchings, fear, and inequality did not change their racial oppression. The North was seen as a promised land, but failed to meet these expectations. I used Photoshop to abstractly show this. In specific places, there's an absence of colors to represent racial oppression, and I use violent imagery to show the fear and violence that they were fleeing from. I wanted to express the false hope that these people had with vibrant but the low-opacity image of a family. Essentially, I wanted to capture the migration, but in a more realistic way, instead of just fleeing and arriving to a safe place, but essentially fleeing and still arriving in the same place but with different scenery.
Something that stood out to me in The Warmth of Other Suns was the failure of media, radio, and newspaper, for example, to condemn violence, and instead its actions glorified violence by publishing the date and time of upcoming lynchings and publishing photos and news articles about them. Another thing that stood out to me was the failure of figures of authority to not only prevent this violence, but to incite justice to the white Americans who blatantly murdered and tortured African Americans. So I chose to write 2 poems, one from the perspective of Claude Neal, a black man who was murdered for the alleged murder of a white woman, and the other from the perspective of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As I saw, it was also a common theme in our lectures that presidents would not always make the right choices, and they would use their choices to justify doing the wrong thing by using political motives. And this project really brought to light the fact that it's important to not take everything for face value, but to see the consequences it has that may not be apparent on the surface. The wrong thing. I've been so wrong all my life. Wrong skin, wrong side of the tracks. No education, no money. But always the right side of the law. Always the right side of the Lord. Thought I could get ahead. Thought I could get an education. But no one wants to teach a black. Boy, was I wrong. No one wants to hire a black. Man, hell, no job. Thought I could have a home. Thought I could love a woman. But no one sees me as a man who you think you are. But no one sees me under this skin as black as wrong. Ah, but wait, she did. She saw underneath the skin. She touched, and suddenly it was right. And I could see beyond. Her skin was white. We loved without color beyond time, beyond a reasonable doubt. It was right, but I was wrong. She was killed for loving me. Now they want their justice. Me at the end of a noose. They say I have to die for what I did to her, but this time they are wrong. I died already when they killed my love. The right reason. Look at this land that I love. This land is blowing away. No one can keep the dust away. Its banks are failing if public enemy number one leaves them any money. And who is this Bonnie and Clyde? The gang who takes and doesn't borrow? Want a job? Ha! Not for 1 1/4 of the people in this breadbasket country where people just wait in line for bread. Brother, can you spare a dime? Strike 1, the Teamsters. Strike 2, the waterfront. Strike 3, the onion pickers. But I can't be out of this game. This land needs me. I've got this new deal to stand beside her and guide her. Bridges to build, jobs to create, laws to enact, homes to protect, retirement to plan, dams to... Damn, I need the South. So now this Claude Neal had to go and get himself hung. This black man, one of 50% unemployed, in this land made for you and me. It's one more wrong thing in a season of wrong things. But the New Deal is right for this country. And damn, I need the South for the New Deal. I can't avenge you, Claude. I can't. Damn the South.
My project is titled The Hidden People That Helped Build America. While looking through Life magazines published from the 1930s to the 1950s to create my project, I quickly noticed that they completely avoided African American representation, even though they were a significant part of the nation and they were at that time making groundbreaking strides that we see the effects of today. My project wanted to look at both sides because sometimes you can't truly understand injustice until you see it from multiple angles. For example, in the magazines, I saw advertisements for leather shoes for kids, and I immediately thought back to how Ida Mae and her sisters did not have any shoes as they walked to their father's funeral. My project wanted to put these two worlds together so the audience can truly understand the extent of cruelty that occurred. I chose to do a collage because I wanted to assemble as many pictures as I could in one space in order to accurately represent what was being portrayed in these magazines. I wanted to convey the blissful ignorance as well as the lavish lifestyle that many were living while others suffered. On the warmth of other sun's side of the board, I only added quotes because I wanted the contrast between both sides to not only stem from the contents of the quotes, but also the appearance of each side. I then added duct tape to portray tangible and intangible borders. The tangible borders being the lack of education, resources, and wealth, and the intangible borders being media portrayal, which I believe contributed to the injustice remaining for as long as it did. As we have seen many times before in history, awareness can sometimes provoke change. However, the realities of these lives were not spoken about. Inequalities persist due to lack of education, lack of accountability, and lack of acknowledgement, and until we learn that, history will continue to repeat itself.
My project is centered around segregation in education. I was really moved by the imagery around education involving colored children in Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. I knew after reading some parts of the book that I wanted to do my project on this in the beginning of the semester, and my process involved creating 3 creative works, 2 of which were paintings that were actually inspired by both Wilkerson and the children behind the education rulings, such as the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. And my 3rd piece was actually a chart comparing how schools are still segregating today, which is shocking. And my project relates to what we have learned in class as we have discussed on numerous occasions, different laws and regulations such as the Pesci versus Ferguson ruling of separate but equal, and I really think this is an important issue that should have a light shined on it because it is still happening today.
My paper is on African American maternal and infant mortality rates and the causes of Black maternal and infant mortality rates being significantly higher than those for white mothers. My thesis is that African American mothers experience higher rates of maternal and infant mortality due to the stress of racism and discrimination. Over time, chronic stress can cause damage to the body, resulting in earlier onset of chronic conditions, including those that predispose women to complications or death in pregnancy. Discrimination also causes Black women to give birth to more preterm babies than white women. Although we cannot solve racism in America overnight, doulas have been identified as a potential tool to reduce the maternal and infant mortality rates.
Doulas act as emotional support for pregnant mothers before, during, and after labor, and act as an advocate for the mother while she is at her most vulnerable. By reducing stress for African American mothers, women that give birth with the doula have shown reduced numbers of preterm births and potentially fewer deaths in pregnancy, although there's ongoing research into the subject. In class, we learned about the discrimination that Black people faced both up north and in the South, the de jure and de facto segregation. Although the civil rights movement ended 50 years ago, African American women continue to suffer the effects of racism and discrimination within our society.
Hi, this is Anamika, and I'm going to talk about my art piece. It depicts the division that existed among the races during the post-Reconstruction era. One half shows a wealthy Caucasian family standing in front of a large house. The other half shows the life of African Americans during this time. You can see some people working for the railroads, while some are picking cotton as part of the sharecropping system. There's a man getting beaten up by a mob of white men. Also in one corner is a man getting lynched while a mob cheers on. It also shows a white-only and a colored-only school. The colored school is crooked and broken down. This shows the sharp contrast that existed between the different races.
This painting focuses on the Cotton Club's contribution to the genre of jazz. Duke Ellington gained his fame in the New York music scene through his performances at the Cotton Club. Located in the neighborhood of Harlem, the club was an important place for many artists in the early 1930s. As the painting is divided in the middle, so was the story behind the Cotton Club. The colorful side shows all the positives that came from the club's existence, mainly the start of musicians such as Ellington's careers. Notable for the opportunities it provided colored performers, it produced some of the most well-known jazz musicians of all times. In contrast, the club was deeply segregated, allowing only whites to watch the predominantly African American-led performances. On the black and white side, the focus is on the white stereotypes of what the African style was supposed to sound like, represented by the jungle plants. Ellington's jungle style of music was a product of white expectations for jazz to be an exotic African experience, but later thrived to become his signature style. Although the Cotton Club was rooted in racist ideologies, it allowed artists to emerge into the global scene for their music.
My project demonstrates the segregation of the black and white communities uniquely. I've made the PowerPoint in the form of a photo book filled with pictures of blacks and whites. The pictures are from the Great Migration era, and I've placed pictures of the two communities side by side, considering the specific instance or event in their daily lives. For example, schools, residential areas, holidays, seating in a bus coach. In some cases, I've taken snippets of blacks and whites from the same picture and placed them alongside each other to contrast their lives and expressions. For example, during lynching, I've contrasted the expressions of the two communities. While for one community it is filled with grief and fear, another community has smile and pride on their faces. This shows the viewers the struggle and segregation blacks faced in their daily lives. I've used Photoshop app to turn the white community's pictures from black and white to color, while I've let the black community's pictures remain black and white to symbolize the dull lives of blacks, which contrasted with the happy, carefree, and colorful lives of the white American community. Thank you.
So the name of my project is Werewolf. It's a short story based on an experience from my own life. It depicts a black girl playing the game Werewolf at a camp, and she is singled out as being the werewolf by everyone around her because she's black, because she's the only black. And to everyone in the room, it's just a joke, but to her, it's like being a criminal, like she's being singled out. Even though she was already the only black person there, she was fully aware of how different she was than everybody else, and that just was the nail in the coffin. And I wrote the story in one sitting with like no edits because it was a form of release for me, because that little girl was me. And I got the chance to finally talk about an experience that scarred me really deeply. And I picked this particular story idea because it resonated with me about how the Northerners responded to black migrants during the migration. And they basically blamed all of their problems on black people just because of the color of those people's skin. And that made me realize that that's something that black people have to deal with even now. Werewolf by R.C. Stewart, based on true events. The thought crossed her mind the moment she closed her eyes. Like a wave of despair crashing down upon her, she knew without a shadow of a doubt what lay at her feet. The game was a classic one, Werewolf. Everyone sits in a circle and is given a card with a single word on it. Moderator, villager, seer, minion, hunter, werewolf. That word is your new identity. It defines your actions. It makes you distrustful and suspicious. It forces you to observe those around you and determine who doesn't belong, to determine the wolves in sheep's clothing. She knew the object of the game and understood the twist that had been added. You see, in this version, everyone was granted, along with their card, a single sheet of paper. The paper was to be laid at the feet of the person thought to be a werewolf during the night, when the players had their eyes closed. The moment her eyes slipped closed, she knew that at her feet would lay 24 pieces of paper, knew that only one other person in the room would have a sheet of paper at their feet, the piece she would place on her turn. The moderator called for daylight, and she, along with her peers, opened her eyes. There was a short silence, a pause so brief it almost wasn't there. The air was tense, barely stifled amusement as all eyes in the circle darted quickly to what now lay at her feet. She knew that moment all too well. The split second before a joke, steeling herself, she glanced down. A smile that didn't quite reach her eyes donning her brown face. She rolled her eyes as laughter filled the room, playing the part they expected of her. She was much too tired to fight this battle. She stood, preparing to plead her case. She stood in the center of the circle, her back to the wall, as she played their game. This was a test, and she knew it. They wanted to see if she had it in her. They wanted to know if she was as good as the rest of them. She stood firm as she spoke, her eyes piercing and unrelenting. She forced her voice to remain strong as she looked to faces that would never understand the impact of this moment. She pled her case and cleared her name. Then she sat. They were amused by her and enjoyed her nature. She was good at what she did. In fact, she was damn good. They no longer questioned why she dared sit in this room next to them. More importantly, they now knew she could take a joke. She'd be invited to sit together at lunch, be listened to during meetings, and be met with nothing less than full acceptance. What they didn't know is that this moment had been spoiled for her. They didn't realize that their acceptance meant nothing, and that she would forever hold this moment in ire. She had just learned one of the most painful lessons life would throw at her. To them, she was a werewolf, a creature of the night that needed to be eradicated. She was unworthy of their town to be included in the life they live. It didn't matter that she changed their minds in the end. She shouldn't have ever had to in the first place. One look at her told them everything they needed to know. A group of perfect strangers decided she was the disease without ever saying a word. She put on a brave face, her smile once again not reaching her eyes, her laugh dry and muted. The pale faces around her would never understand the innocence they killed in her that night, would never understand the fight that awoke in her or the rage that bubbled just underneath the surface. She glanced down at the card in her hand, rubbing her brown thumb over the single word written on it, desperate to etch it into her memory. She held back tears as she tried to remember she was more than what they thought. She looked up once again, that dead smile marring her features, her thumb still tracing the simple black lettering. Villager.
Our project is titled Women and is a collage of African American women and their efforts and accomplishments in the civil rights movement during the 20th century. The word women represents the geographical areas of the United States, with the letters W and O representing women in the West Coast, the M and A representing women in the South and Middle region, and the N and exclamation point representing women in the East Coast. Since we are minorities and young women, we decided to commemorate those who have worked hard for the rights that we have, and decided to focus on how these women fought for rights as African Americans and as women. Since we could not gather together, we decided to create the project digitally so that it would be easier for everybody to access.
My painting is called The Empty Room, and it shows an African American music group performing to an empty club. And this symbolizes that African American celebrities were treated different than white celebrities, even though both of them were famous.
So I did a poem for the creative aspect of my project. And I usually do like writing poems anyways, but the reason or the process through this one was I was listening to a song, as I frequently do when I'm thinking about things, and then I just kind of latched onto one of them, and that's why there's specific lyrics that are within that song. It's like a foundation to it, I suppose. And it's a Chinese song, so I translated some of the meanings over. But basically, I tweaked it to where it would seem like the different divisions were giving certain reasons about why they were the victims, why they were being mistreated, and how, they don't want to be friends, they don't want to talk about stuff. And so, to me, when I first, kind of read, especially the chapter about divisions, in, the book, I got reminded a lot about just my own ethnicity, Chinese, and Chinese Americans, and how they had hardships as well coming over. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of do something a little bit related about that as well. I love thee, or so you say. Hated you for so long, gosh, it's been so long. You think you had it worse? At least you knew how to talk. I'm stuck with the language barrier curse. I love thee, so you say, and you think I'm that easy to appease? I love thee, shut up and remember this language is still new to me. Loathed you for so long, gosh, it's been so long. You think I have it best. At least you somehow got a job. You making more than me is something I detest. I love thee, so you say, but why should I believe? I love thee, taking away all our jobs, you think that's funny. Envied you for so long, gosh, it's been so long. You think I'm lucky? At least you look similar all along. I must carry around this skin to be bloodied. I love thee, say, aren't we fighting a common enemy? I love thee, yet why can't we coexist peacefully? I love thee, so you say, but when has it been that easy? I love thee, who still says that? Shouldn't it be, I love me? Just remember this poem. 煮豆燃豆萁，豆在釜中泣，本是同根生，相煎何太急。Boiling beans while charring their stalks, and of this the beans wailed in the pot. All born from the same parent sprout, what are you burning us so hastily about?